2 years ago, back in the early days of the pandemic. Remember that? People were publicly thanking their local grocery store workers and standing to applaud hospital employees after their shifts. Remember banging your pots and pans on your front step to show support for healthcare workers. We realized how much we rely on all of those people all the time, but especially when so much of society is in limbo. At the same time, essential workers were fighting for basic rights such as paid sick days and access to childcare. But how well has our society responded to the needs of the people on whom we depend so much? Lana Payne is National Secretary-Treasurer of Unifor, and she spoke with CBC's Leanne Power.
When the pandemic began 2 years ago, workers were fighting for things like a living wage and paid sick days. What have we learned from the pandemic in terms of the needs of workers and how well we're meeting them?
Can you imagine? We're still fighting for paid sick days for basically essential workers in the middle of a global pandemic. And I think that kind of says it all about the stark divide that we have between the haves and everybody else. In the last week, if we needed a reminder of how challenging this moment has been and how inequality has really grown, during the pandemic, we saw, a Globe and Mail report that had grocery store barons seeing their compensation, their profits, their bonuses skyrocket during the pandemic, and at the same time, slashing pandemic pay for grocery store workers. We saw, the latest annual report from the Canadian Centre of Policy Alternatives, talking about, CEO pay for the top 100 CEOs in Canada. And they all saw their bonuses, go through the roof. I mean, their average take-home pay around compensation was $10.9 million a year. And many of these CEOs, the companies that they work for, also received government support, wage subsidies from the federal government. So it's pretty stark when you start laying out the facts of those sorts of things, of, having to fight for paid sick days on the one hand and CEOs just raking in massive bonuses on the other. And I think the third report we saw, obviously, was this, the top 500 billionaires in the world increased their wealth in the last year by $1 trillion. Whoever would have thought we'd even be talking about trillions of dollars being owned by individuals, but that's where we are. So we have to, I think, as a society, as a country, as a province, really look at these kinds of inequalities and say, what are we going to do about this? And how are we going to build back from this pandemic better so that working people are not left behind? Because we're really on a cusp of creating a much greater income inequality problem for the world as a result of this horrible crisis that we've been facing. And, in many cases, a lot of the challenges that we faced as a society really got exposed during this pandemic, whether it was, racial inequalities, gender inequalities, class inequalities. We saw women who were forced, out of the workplace, no other choice but to stay home and care for children because schools were closed and daycares were closed. So the impact on women throughout this pandemic has been, disproportionately greater, I would argue. And we saw that our social safety net just was not up to meeting the challenge. Major problems with things like employment insurance that had left, the bulk of unemployed workers behind. And, kudos to the government with lots of pressure as well. They, basically had to create a new social safety net overnight, or millions of Canadians would have been left with nothing. So, all of these things we have to remember as we, if we ever do come out of this pandemic, that we can't be in that place again, because we're going to be dealing with other crises, whether it's the climate crisis, et cetera. And we have to as a society, be prepared for those things.
Have we learned and fixed any of the problems that we had pre-pandemic?
So I would argue that there have been some victories. I do also believe that there is, eyes are open to some of these problems, Leanne, that probably weren't open to them before. And I do think it's the job of us in trade unions and progressive organizations, people who care about these things and work with these things every day, to continue to push for the kind of society that we know that we need. And, to me, it just is a shameful kind of a reflection that we have to fight for things that should be a given, whether it's paid sick days, whether it's, strong, safe workplaces, what I would call decent work for working people. And we hear, this notion of we got to get back to normal. I don't know if you're hearing that in your conversations. It's like, I can't wait to get back to normal. Well, in reality, normal for a lot of people was not that great. They were employed in precarious jobs. In Newfoundland and Labrador, we still have one of the lowest minimum wages in the country. We have a large portion of our population pre-pandemic who basically earned under $15 an hour, I think a full 30% of the labor market. This is like huge. And it's partly why we see this inequality. And, we've made some improvements. Obviously, we have a new child care program now in the country that many provinces are taking up on. But, you look at it, these are things that women and unions have been fighting for 30, 40 years, and we're only now getting to the point where they're getting achieved. So some of these things require us to continue to push. And I would say in the last year, we saw workers fighting back in a way that they hadn't in a long time. We had more disputes in our union. We had workers raising their expectations and saying, I deserve better. And they do deserve better. And I think you're going to see a lot more pressure at collective bargaining tables to have collective agreements that are, enhanced. And this will put pressure on the non-union sector as well to have to make improvements there. But the reality is that governments have a role to have a floor, and that floor should deliver a number of things to working people. And I can honestly say to you that not in one jurisdiction of the country do we have a set of labor standards that does that at the moment.
That's Lana Payne, the National Secretary-Treasurer of Unifor. She was speaking with CBC's Leanne Power.